Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. I'm Lynn Weil, the Director of External Affairs at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, with Georgetown University. Today, we'll examine how content generation systems can create disinformation at scale and how we might guard against potential coming risks and other issues involving automated disinformation. But first, I'd like to do a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and you experience any technical issues, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time for our moderator to get things started. Girish Sastry is with the policy research team at OpenAI, where he currently focuses on issues related to the security, misuse, and evaluation of AI systems. Prior to OpenAI, he spent some time as a research engineer in machine learning at the University of Oxford and as a data scientist at various internet technology startups. We are fortunate that he worked closely with CSET to enable our researchers to complete the fascinating analysis that they're going to discuss with you here today. Girish, over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm very excited for this. And first, I will take a moment to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Katerina Sadova, who is a research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she works on the Cyber AI project. Most recently, she advised on cybersecurity and tech policy issues and drafted key legislation as a Tech Congress Fellow with the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. She holds a BA in Political Science from California State University and an MS in Foreign Service from Georgetown, where she focused on strategic competition in cyber, Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. Next, we have Andrew Lone, who is a senior fellow at CSET, where he works on the Cyber AI project. Prior to joining CSET, he was an information scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he led research focusing on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Before RAND, Andrew worked in material science and nanotechnology. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from UC Santa Cruz and a bachelor's in engineering from McMaster University. Finally, we have Micah Musser, who is a research analyst at CSET on the Cyber AI project. Previously, he worked as a research assistant at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He graduated from Georgetown University's College of Arts and Sciences with a BA in government. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks to the Cyber AI team for doing this awesome analysis, and I will let you all take it away.
Okay, so I'm Andrew Lone. Thanks for the introduction, Girish. Today, what we're going to be talking about are mostly large language models and their ability to write disinformation. Now, large language models are really the focus of a lot of AI progress over the recent last couple of years. But it's a little bit strange when you think about what they're doing. Basically, what Micah Musser, who you'll hear from in a little bit, likes to say is that these text generation models are really just autocomplete on steroids. And we don't usually think of autocomplete as being very capable. When I'm writing and autocomplete pops up, usually I try to avoid what it says as quickly as I can. But with these really large language models, the autocomplete is really capable, and you can tailor what you're starting with to get it to write all sorts of things. For example, if you wanted to do translations, you can give it a couple of examples of like a French word and then an English word, then a French word and an English word. And then if you leave the French word and let it complete, it'll know that what you're looking for is the English equivalent of that French word. Or if you start writing a news article and you stop in the middle, it can tell that by the tone of what you're writing and the content that you're looking for a news article and try to continue along in that vein. The same thing if you're writing a novel and you start off with an interesting plot point. It can pick up from the tone of the way that you're writing and the topics of what you're writing and continue along that trend. Now, these techniques are not perfect, but what we've tried to do here is understand if you start writing disinformation, or if you trigger it in a way to write disinformation, how capable is it of writing that disinformation? And we've grown pretty concerned because in these other areas of application, the translations, question answering, things like that, these language models have become very, very capable. And it's difficult for humans to tell what's written by a human and what's written by a machine. Now, let me take a quick second and walk us through machine learning to see where we get to these large language models. Next slide, Micah. So deep learning was really kicked off in about 2012 based on image recognition. So these are images from a data set called ImageNet, and there are all sorts of different topics like animals or boats or cars or telephones, and they're at pretty high resolution. So it took large networks of large neural networks in order to be able to just analyze this many pixels in these high resolution images, and then also to have to be able to determine what those pictures are of at high enough accuracies to be useful. 2012 was a big breakthrough year where deep neural networks that with many layers started to become a viable option, and they blew away the competition. And then since then, there's been incredible progress extending those deep networks to deeper and deeper networks to more and more parameters that have more capacity to learn and can take in more and more information, more and more data. Humans have an accuracy around 95% at these tasks, something in that range, and years ago that was surpassed by these deep neural networks. As they got larger and larger, they increasingly had more and more parameters, of course, to build up that capacity. And the one I'd like to point you to is called Noisy Student in 2019. Not because it's a particularly astounding one, it's just kind of the best of the year, but because that was the year that OpenAI released GPT-2, which is GPT-3's predecessor, of course. Next slide. So Noisy Student, the record at the time for image processing had 66 million parameters. GPT-2 in the same year had 1.5 billion, just way more parameters. And so it was a highly capable model in its own right, but this GPT-2 was used for text rather than image processing. And so it did this autocomplete on steroids that we were talking about. But as you start to play with GPT-2, it doesn't take long to realize that it says all sorts of biased or concerning things. And so OpenAI, who built it, didn't release it publicly when they built it. They said instead, due to concerns about large language models being used to generate deceptive, biased, or abusive language at scale, we are only releasing a much smaller version of GPT-2 along with sampling code. So what they did is they showed what it could do, but didn't release the code publicly because of fears of how it might be used in, say, disinformation campaigns. But within maybe 6 months or so, there were other replications that were available openly. And now GPT-2 in all of its sizes is available to be downloaded freely on the internet. But 1 year later, OpenAI released GPT-3, which was orders of magnitude larger again. Next slide, please. And so the graph we have on the left is the one from the previous slide, but the one on the right shows that same graph with GPT-3 for scale. And you can just kind of see GPT-2. Noisy Student doesn't even show up on the graph. GPT-3 is that much larger, 175 billion parameters. Now, in order to train such a large model, you need a lot of data. And some of it's not great. There are high quality sources like Wikipedia, and to train it, they drew 3 billion tokens from Wikipedia. Tokens are you can basically think of them as words, but really they're word fragments that are in the vocabulary of these language models. They don't have the exact same vocabulary that we do. But with only 3 billion tokens from Wikipedia, they extended their data set to Common Crawl with 410 billion tokens, much larger sampling. Common Crawl is basically the internet. And as we all know, the internet is not always the nicest or safest of places. So there's a lot of dangerous stuff built into this model. And our job, that I thank OpenAI for giving us the opportunity to do, was to try to find out what could be drawn out. how much of that nasty content could be drawn out and for what nefarious purposes. And so for that, I'll pass it over to Micah to get into the details.
All right, thanks, Drew, for covering how we got here, how we got to GPT-3. In this section, I'm going to talk a bit about using GPT-3 and some of GPT-3's capabilities. And then I'll hand it off to Katya, who will cover a bit of the threat model, questions like who has access to this and what does the future look like. The first thing to say about using GPT-3 is that once you have access, a lot of the thing that most people do first is they log on to the website. There's a web-based way of interfacing with the model called the playground, where essentially you just put in a starting prompt. Here I just seeded GPT-3 with the text in bold. The researchers were demonstrating their new AI to their webinar audience when suddenly there was a glitch. And from here, I can just adjust a few parameters at the side, and right away, GPT-3, as soon as I hit submit, will start and continue that text. The AI started to act in an unpredicted way. The researchers had no idea what was happening or why. And it can continue writing like this, building and drawing out new themes, going in unexpected directions for up to around 800 words. So the length of a decently sized news article, really. Now, this way of interfacing with GPT-3 is interesting, but a bit cumbersome because you have to write one prompt at a time and feed it in. But OpenAI also allows API access to the model, where you can access it directly from a coding environment, typically Python, and you can do even more stuff with it. You can ask it to generate multiple completions automatically and do them in parallel so that you can generate more at once. And here I have a picture of what that, the very simple code that it takes to do that, just from within a Jupyter notebook. For those of you who code, that's a way of using Python. So it only takes a few lines of code here to write a prompt, submit it to GPT-3, and generate multiple outputs in parallel. And what this allows, this ability to interface with GPT-3 through code, is the ability to build more complex applications on top of the model. So we, near the end of our research, we actually constructed a bit of a demo tool. We won't show you the demo, but I do have a screenshot here. We essentially tried to simulate what a GPT-3 only social media feed might look like. And we called our demo tool twatter.com. And so in this example, basically, I've given GPT-3 5 fairly recent tweets from CSET's Twitter account, and I've asked it to generate more. Where I actually actively interacting with this feed would just sort of be scrolling on the side, and it could be continuously generating more tweets in the style of CSET. And this sort of gets to something very interesting about GPT-3, because these sorts of applications allow you to interact with the model in dynamic ways, not just receiving outputs. These +1 buttons in our fake little feed here would allow me to click a +1 and right away shuffle an output of GPT-3 right back into its input. And the reason we highlight this is because this gets to something we call human-machine teaming. Basically, the idea that a lot of the time popular imagination is sort of seized by these language models just writing totally autonomously. But we find in practice that actually you get the best results if you can set up rapidly iterating feedback loops between a human and a model, if you can have teams. And a savvy operator, if they wanted to further improve this sort of setup, could do a lot of other things. You could code in the ability to slightly adjust these output tweets before feeding them back in. For instance, in one of these tweets, our GPT-3 bot claims that we have CSET director Andrew K. Lone, which is inaccurate. Andrew is not actually our director, but an operator might be able to just take that and replace the job title and feed it back in. So this concept of human-machine teaming is one that we want to emphasize because it more than the machine alone, it provides a way for disinformation operators to scale up their operations while maintaining a high quality outputs and the ability to vet those outputs as they come through. And before I hand it off to Katya, I'll go through now a couple of different ways that disinformation operators could use a system like GPT-3. And we tested each of these, and I'll give a brief assessment of how we found it to be. The first is sort of just what I showed you. Just give GPT-3 a few tweets and have it generate more on the theme. And this is really where GPT-3 excels. This is the thing that it does best at. Tweets are short and snappy. Large language models, to the extent that they still generate some shaky text, usually it's because they write for too long and they start to stray off topic. But tweets don't really run into that problem. And a few short tweets gives GPT-3 more than enough information to detect similarities in tone, in topic, in slant, and to generate functionally a more or less limitless number of those tweets. And with a human machine team, those tweets as their output can be tailored more and more precisely over time. Now, one reason disinformation operators might do this is because today, a lot of disinformation relies on multiple tiers of accounts. Operators will have some accounts that they invest a lot of time in to build up personas, but they'll also manage a lot of more bot-like accounts that really just exist to retweet content and amplify it. But those sorts of actions could be made much more persuasive or much more realistic seeming if instead of merely retweeting or resharing, some sort of comment was added, some little extra thing that makes it seem like a real human adding their commentary. And GPT-3 provides a very easy way to scale up, especially those fairly low-risk parts of a disinformation operation. Another thing operators might want to do is take a headline and flesh out a lengthy news story to appear to justify that headline or corroborate it. We tested GPT-3 for this. Actually, when OpenAI released their first research paper on GPT-3, they tested this sort of thing with human survey respondents, and they found that up to 80% of humans could be fooled into thinking that these news stories came from a real human author. But not only can the story seem plausible, we found that actually even just a headline alone, operators can give sufficient information to meaningfully tailor the slant and the tone of the article that GPT-3 produces to match, which gives another way of controlling and steering the model. Another test we ran was the ability of GPT-3 to take a breaking news story and spin it to fit with a pre-chosen narrative. This is really a pretty cognitively complex task. Even if you asked a lot of humans to do this, they might struggle to find ways of doing it persuasively. And so GPT-3 doesn't do as well here as some of the more simple things like generating tweets. But we generated about 1 or 2 dozen of these sorts of rewrites, and we gave them to some of our colleagues and had them assess the authenticity. And at least a few of these were able to fool our colleagues. Sometimes they contain obvious clues. For instance, when we tried to get GPT-3 to rewrite the AP's coverage of the Lafayette Square protests last year, it referred to then President Trump as Mayor Trump, which is a bit of a dead giveaway that something's not quite right. But those are also the sorts of mistakes that one human overseeing the process could very easily edit out. A fourth use case is to write divisive messages that target specific racial or religious groups. Because GPT-3 has been trained on a huge percentage of what's on the internet, we find that it knows how to be divisive and cruel. And it's very effective at coming up with messages that seem to target specific groups insultingly, and it can say really horrifying things. And because division is often a core goal of disinformation operators, this presents another worrying way in which they might try to use these models. And finally, we wanted to test GPT-3's actual persuasiveness on various major issues. So in one experiment, we generated a lot of short arguments from GPT-3 having to do with whether or not to impose sanctions on China and whether or not to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. And then we showed those arguments to a sample of about 2,000 Americans recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk. And we asked them their views on these issues after having read these. And we found that sometimes being exposed to GPT-3 generated arguments actually shifted people's views considerably. For instance, after reading arguments opposed to imposing sanctions on China, respondents were 50% more likely to also oppose those sanctions relative to our control group. I want to emphasize that there's a lot of uncertainty around these findings. For instance, we don't know how long-lasting these effects are. We also don't know how much of this can be chalked up to mere exposure, the well-covered psychological phenomenon that merely being exposed to a viewpoint can increase people's receptivity to it, independent of the actual content or persuasiveness of the argument. So we don't know how much of this is really attributable to GPT-3 as a particularly persuasive entity, but we do know that at least in the short term, being exposed to arguments generated by GPT-3 can shift people's views. And theoretically, disinformation operators could use a system like this to generate many more of these types of arguments and shift lots of people's views at key moments in time. So I'll stop there, and I will pass it over now to my colleague, Katya Sadova, who will talk about the threat model for these models going forward.
Thanks, Micah, and thank you, Drew. Next slide, please. So if we could do these experiments, who else can, for perhaps more nefarious purposes? Today, anyone from individuals to well-resourced state and non-state actors can access varying degrees of capability. Anyone who has the time, enough computing power, and some technical skills can work with now publicly available GPT-2 apps or code libraries and write millions of messages if they want to. Access to GPT-3 is restricted to vetted researchers and developers, but other subscription-based pay-for-use arrangements are also emerging, such as an Israeli-made Jurassic 1 jumbo system, for example. This also puts a lot of responsibility of vetting and monitoring for misuse on the firms that provide access to these novel models. There are also open source replicas of GPT-3 emerging. AI Collective recently publicly released a smaller clone of GPT-3, and bigger versions are likely coming. Well-resourced actors, from nation states to private corporations and influence for hire firms, can and may in fact incorporate these publicly available capabilities to help automate the more labor-intensive parts of generating disinformation content, augmenting the human content farms that do some of this work today. Finally, well-resourced actors can also develop their own novel language models, though it can cost millions of dollars in both engineering talent and compute. While this is a barrier for wider use, it is well within the reach of well-resourced actors. Next slide, please, Micah. So despite the cost of developing novel systems, the diffusion of large language models is already underway. In a little over a year since the release of GPT-3, more models, some of them larger and more complex, have been announced or released with capabilities in multiple languages. Several models have matched or exceeded the size of GPT-3 and joined what Jack Clark calls the 3 comma club, meaning models with hundreds of billions of parameters and offering capabilities that are likely just as impressive or more. While over 90% of GPT-3's training data was in English, these other models are enhancing capabilities in other languages, such as Chinese, Korean, Russian, French, just to name a few. And this diffusion is very likely to continue as NVIDIA and partners develop frameworks to help train even larger models with trillions of parameters, such as Wu 2.0, for example. The key point here is this: some of the above systems will be openly available, which means malicious actors with some technical skill and deep pockets may have powerful tools at their disposal. Next slide, please, Micah. So what's the bottom line on these systems and their use for disinformation? Well, first, the dual use and open nature of AI research field, particularly of releasing research publicly, is a challenge. Large language models can be used to enlighten, inspire, entertain with fiction and poetry, and even op-eds in The Guardian that are nearly indistinguishable from human writing. But they can also help disinformation actors to deceive, distort, and divide to undermine trust. The openness of AI research culture encourages the publication of code and models and demos for researchers to be able to replicate and build on and advance research. Yet there's no consensus on how to balance this need to share research with concerns of misuse, nor are there standards for publication or governance in place to guide them. Second, even if not fully automated end-to-end, so far, these systems may effectively augment human operators and show potential to increase the scale of disinformation content, both in volume and opportunities to iterate on the themes. They can free cognitive resources of the operators to focus on other aspects of building disinformation campaigns, like cultivating more nuanced social media personas and authentic influencers to deliver content. Or they can help operators experiment and craft more precise messages to find those that resonate and are likely to spread organically by authentic users. They can also help mask operations and make them harder to detect. The fewer humans involved, the easier it is to hide the operation. These systems don't tire under pressure of performance quotas, nor do they suffer crisis of conscience, as some former Russian internet research agency trolls did, which in part helped expose their operations. Third, one of the more concerning insights from our work, as Micah noted and Drew noted, was that GPT-3 was stronger at writing content with a particular slant than neutral content. Its ability to feed conspiracy theories, such as mimicking the style of QAnon, for example, and to create more extremist text was troubling to us. This can ease the work of manipulators who seek to exploit societal fissures and divide. Fourth, detection based on the content itself is also challenging. On the technical level, synthetic text looks like any other text on the internet. It provides no signs of authorship or signatures or special metadata, which makes it harder for browsers or social media platforms to detect and flag it in real time to prevent users from even seeing it. Although its output can have quirks and contextual errors, as Micah noted, these can be edited out by the operators before posting. Some detection experiments so far look for use of common words and phrases, and we can unpack this a bit more in Q&A. But in general, we are skeptical that meaningful ways to detect outputs by analyzing text itself are feasible at this time. Fifth, other technical mitigations are also hard. We concluded in our paper that mitigations would have to focus on the infrastructure operators use, such as social media accounts, spewing too much content, or other signs of inauthenticity and coordination. But this is also not foolproof. Recent operations are more targeted, more nuanced, less noisy than the Russian IRA campaign in 2016, for example. They more frequently develop on inauthentic news media sites and across multiple social media platforms or fringe forums that are often not as diligent at monitoring for malicious activity. Often with only small portion of operations surfacing on larger platforms that may have more robust threat hunting and detection tools. So prolific accounts aren't necessarily going to be detected or throttled before reaching their target audience. Finally, as publicly available models emerge in more languages, they increase the potential for exploitation of more information environments around the world from both foreign, domestic, or transnational actors. These capabilities can make it easier for non-native speakers to target information environments of other states and make uncovering operations harder when posts read authentic. So it's a double-edged sword. Nations pushing to advance this research in the AI race as a point of national pride and prestige may inadvertently make themselves and information environments of other nations operating in those languages more vulnerable, potentially helping disinformation operators to target them. To close, I'll circle back to our original question. Can AI write disinformation? Our research shows that yes, it can, particularly as part of a human-machine team. As with other dual-use technologies, the challenge for the global policy, technology, and research community is to find ways to empower the advancement of this inspiring technology while mitigating its harms to trust, domestically and internationally. I'll stop here, and we look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Katya, Drew, and Micah. So everyone who's listening in, now is a great time to put your questions in the chat, and I will moderate and ask the panelists your questions. And maybe to kick things off, one thing I'm curious about is, have we actually seen any use of these systems or systems like them in the wild?
Well,
I can take that one. Yeah, so it's unclear is basically the bottom line. We don't have a good way of knowing this. Katya spoke a little bit in her portion about the difficulties of detection, but I'll just expand on that just a bit. So those of you who are familiar with some of the other issues in AI, the AI space, may know that deep fakes have also been a big topic. But some researchers have found that deep fakes are sometimes detectable. They leave patterns throughout the pixels that kind of speak to machine authorship. The problem is that for text, especially at the length of, say, a tweet or a social media post, there aren't enough unique words for a reliable pattern to sort of emerge in the way that it can for an image of thousands and thousands of pixels. And so this dramatically increases the difficulty of detecting when a text has actually been authored by a machine. And for that reason, it's very hard, even if you had data on, the entire repository of all tweets, it would be very hard to scan for any signs of machine authorship. The best we can do at this point is sort of guess. It would not surprise me to know that disinformation operators have begun using large language models, although it would probably be a fairly recent development, certainly not true back in even as late as 2018, maybe even 2019. But ultimately, we don't have a good way to know for sure.
Thanks, Micah. And I guess a related question, and maybe I'll pitch this one to Drew, is could we actually leverage GPT-3-like systems to detect these texts that are potentially being created and actually maybe tag them as disinformation?
Well, I guess the answer is yes, we could try. I would say that I'd be surprised if it was very successful. It's certainly a thing that can be attempted, but so because GPT-3 and these large language models are able to do labeling of sorts, where you give it one thing and you train it, say, to label that as Russian text, or that was written by Shakespeare. And you could have it try to write to label text as machine generated. But machine generated is so similar to human generated, especially for small blocks of text, that it's a very, very difficult problem for specifically the reasons that Micah just described.
Gotcha. And let's see. So we're getting a lot of questions about potential mitigations to this, a couple of which that I just mentioned. And here's another interesting idea that I'd be curious for the panelists' thoughts on, which is, could we use these very systems to mount a counterattack and sort of like drown out the disinformation? And would that be a good idea?
Well, I can take this one. Could it be an automated counterattack? I think Micah very well explained that this system as it exists today is best used when working with an operator, iterating on the theme. If the goal is to, for example, pre-bunk an idea, for example, or say, we know that a particular line of disinformation is starting to bubble up and starting to get a little more viral, it is possible to use this tool for good in a way and counter with mass sort of strategic communication, shall we say, to flood the information environment with positive information about a particular subject. Because disinformation actors often do exploit the voids in the information environment. So things that, for example, aren't necessarily, don't necessarily have a lot of information online. So there are ways to use this for positive uses as well. Is that a good idea? That, I think, is an unsettled question. I think it's a question for us as a society to continue debating, both at peacetime and at wartime. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Katja. And so we have a few questions about the details of the survey methodology. And I think people are curious about what exactly happened there and like what caused people to change their minds. And specifically, so Gerald Epstein asks, when you shift subjects' opinions using GPT-3 generated arguments, do you then go back and explain to them that what they read was intentionally slanted and then give them a neutral, less biased version?
Yeah, so I was the one who ran that section of our experiment, so I'll try to answer that. I'll start by saying that we ran all of this through our human subject protection boards, and we're very thorough with our ethics and our diligence there. And so it's like when you're doing survey questions, survey methodologies, they're often difficult ethics problems. So it's important to reach out for those helps. And we did everything that we could to try to minimize all of the damages as possible. We did explain at the end that they were being told intentionally slanted arguments by a machine, and so that part was taken into account. And yeah, there are some concerns. We did as much as we could, and we also didn't do several experiments that would have been really worthwhile to understand. In fact, this gets at one of the big fears that we have about AI models and their malicious use, is that we don't really have a great understanding of how people respond to disinformation. In some cases, there were some cases where we actually had opposite reactions, and that's a known phenomenon, like a boomerang effect that occurs. We don't know how to phrase our disinformation in a way that maximizes its impact. We are constrained in the scale of experiment that we can do for all of these ethical reasons, rightfully so, but nefarious and malicious adversaries are not so constrained. And we think that the ability to generate massive volumes of diverse disinformation content and monitor the responses is going to give them the ability to learn more about human responses to disinformation and optimize their disinformation in a way that's hard to do in a safe way. That actually learning how to conduct disinformation might be one of the biggest benefits of having a disinformation generator.
That's interesting. And so one thing that your answer just pointed to is if we want to sort of get ahead of these risks, we're a little bit constrained in the sort of foresight we can actually have because of the reasons you just mentioned. And we've also spent some time talking about technical detection methods, and a bunch of people in the chat are curious about non-technical ways to provide mitigations. So should there be more strict regulation for these technologies is one question. And maybe Micah, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so thanks, Garish. I'll actually start with this. One of our, one question we got gestured at the Computer Fraud Authorization Act. One of our askers sort of suggested that maybe one way to combat this would be to focus on web scraping and sort of the question of, would this massive automated text or data collection process, is that a possible point of intervention? And so the first piece of bad news I have is the answer to that question is probably no. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want this to be taken as the truth here, but the Supreme Court this term actually ruled on more or less this precise question and decided that activities online, if there aren't technical instruments in place that prevent an actor from collecting some piece of information online, it doesn't violate the CFAA to collect that information, even if it technically violates a term of service. And this sort of, I think, was widely read as basically giving the okay to automated web scraping tools. So at the data collection phase, it's not clear that there's a legal hook to intervene. The other thing that makes some regulation difficult is this proliferation that Katya mentioned. The difficulty with a lot of AI issues is that one company or organization can invest tremendous effort in building a new model. But once they've announced it, sometimes even merely announcing the fact that they have done it is enough. Oftentimes, other actors can gather and find ways to reproduce it within a lag of 6 months to a year often. So this proliferation makes regulation a bit tricky because many of these actors would not be subject to US regulations. And there's a sort of very rapid proliferation of them. That being said, there are some steps that groups like OpenAI could take, whether because they choose to do so or because there would be regulation. Those might involve, for instance, tracking usage, which is something that OpenAI already tries to do, but trying to ensure that everyone who has access to the model, the amount of tokens that they request in a certain time frame is monitored. Maybe even some basic attempts to monitor what prompts are being fed to it, if those prompts make sense given the. So I'll clarify that to get access to GPT-3 today, most researchers have to submit a sort of statement explaining what they want to use it for and what their purpose is. And so you could hypothetically think of a system that would check the prompts they're actually submitting and try to determine, is this a likely activity? These are very partial solutions. Even if they were implemented perfectly at the level of all the companies that are subject to the US jurisdiction, there would be many other models openly available online that would be extremely difficult to track and control. I'll stop there, but thank you for all the questions on this topic.
Katya, I'm curious if you have anything to add on the proliferation question, because you had a slide about all the other big models that are being created out in the world. Do we know if any any mechanisms like delaying release would actually have a meaningful effect on what the rest of the world does?
Well, it's a good question. And I think we don't know until we try is one of the answers. I think the point that I'm trying to get across, and I think what all of us are emphasizing, is that we need a robust discussion about the rules of engagement in this space, the rules of publication, and robust understanding from the researchers of how they can still advance this research without necessarily publicly releasing these models and how much of the model to release. Right now, there's a debate and some researchers are starting to throttle back themselves, how much they release. They start to consider misuse questions, but this isn't something that is applied universally in the US. And certainly there's not, that I am aware of, an international multilateral and multi-stakeholder engagement on this issue that would be necessary to understand where we are. Because obviously, GPT-3 certainly gives tools to non-English speakers to potentially exploit English-speaking environment, although it is capable of doing that in other languages as well. But there are other tools being developed in other languages. And in a way, as we're chasing pride and prestige, we're also in a way developing a deterrence mechanism of sorts. But that deterrence mechanism only applies if states choose not to use the tools in other languages. And I think that is asymmetric right now. I think potentially some nation states use some rules of engagement while others don't. And that's just going to the foreign influence aspect of this issue. What worries me is incorporation of these tools by influence for hire firms and also domestic actors. And there are a couple of things you can do in that space. In the domestic sense, we can certainly have a discussion about the use of artificial amplification in our political process. We can do that, other nations can do that to the extent that they wish. We can start developing norms where political actors, for example, choose voluntarily to subscribe to a code of conduct not to use these kinds of tools. Finally, the influence for hire firms is something that worries me because these actors exist in a way beyond states. And 1 minute they're doing a campaign in one nation and another minute they're going to do a campaign in another. And so we need to look carefully at the tools, the legal tools and other tools we have to act against those actors. And we can say that it's the responsibility of the social media platforms to do that. And they have acted quite a bit against the what some platforms called inauthentic behavior, but they're not the only ones. I think, as in many agreements on cybercrime, for example, internationally, there's probably room for discussion, the discussion that has to involve not just governments, but also multi-stakeholder actors, researchers, technology actors, to have a meaningful set of solutions going forward.
Thanks, Katya. And we have a question, I think, for Drew here. This is sort of a two-part question. So one part is, so in this work, you did a lot of work with GPT-3, which is sort of a specific point on the graph of how big models are in their parameters. Do we know anything about whether smaller models that are smaller than GPT-3 can do these same kinds of tasks? And on the flip side, what do we know about the future of these systems? And if they will actually run into any bottlenecks, or will they just continue getting better at these disinformation tasks?
Right. Well, it's on the one hand, I've got a bunch that I can say about that. On the other hand, you're the one that works at OpenAI, but I'll say what I could say. So these models are huge, and they're a real pain to work with if you're at OpenAI. They're really easy to work with if you're at CSET. We just do, like Micah showed you, a couple lines of code. But the people who actually train these things and build them, they have to work some miracles to combine all of the computers together and to collect the data and to run it through it. By our estimates, that OpenAI hasn't released a number. By our estimates, it's somewhere in the few millions of dollars to train a GPT-3. Now, in order to train a much bigger, a GPT-4 type of model, we're estimating several orders of magnitude more expensive than that. So big numbers for most organizations, easily accessible for nation states. And so it's certainly a possible thing that people would pursue. But there's been a bit of a lag. We might have expected, based on historical progress, to be at those points a little quicker than we have been. And so there's forthcoming CSET research that will try to address that question. But the other question that you brought up is an alternate path. Instead of building a massive GPT-4, maybe we can figure out smaller GPT-3s that are easier to run, that don't require so much crazy training. One of the simple ways to do that is to take a GPT-3 that exists and then condense it down into a smaller network. That's a technique that happens. And then people are also trying to work on how do you build smaller models that are equally capable. Both of those things are making progress. Those are also hard problems, maybe not as hard as figuring out how to make a computer that can run 100 trillion parameters. But both of them are going to take some breakthroughs, and the breakthroughs are coming on both ends. There's been proof that you can make a 1 trillion parameter network, which is like 5 times bigger than GPT-3, and there's been progress in making smaller models that outperform GPT-3.
And a quick follow-up to that, based on your experience, do you have any speculations on what the impacts might be with, a 1 trillion parameter, 100 trillion parameter model, which it seems like our society has line of sight to?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I guess the concern I have is that there are things that GPT-3 does kind of poorly, but like it makes mistakes that give it away, or it doesn't write very long things that are coherent. It can't maintain its coherency for all that long. And I think that those things might go away. Also, what we struggle to get it to do is interact with people. And partly that's because it's easy to trick it. And so if you were trying to have like a trolling bot that would go back and forth with you, that was something that we thought might be a bridge too far for today, unless you were really good at figuring out how to make this work that we want. A similar type of problem. So one part of that is the ability of the model itself. Another part is just the amount of text that you can spit in there in the input is limited. And so without even having to grow the model, if you can expand the input range, then you can provide more context and more information to try to nail it into that context, keep it cohere, give it more information to work with. That's a different type of improvement that's not even about expanding the model itself. Expanding the input space is a different avenue to progress.
So we spent some time discussing the proliferation problem and the difficulty of detection. What sort of procedures should developers take? Like, what sort of guardrails should OpenAI and others be considering as we kind of push the boundaries on these technologies?
I can take this one. Well, again, I think applying threat modeling techniques to understand who can use the technology and how. Beyond disinformation, there are implications here that are bigger than hostile, malign influence operations. So I think it's really important for AI researchers to work with communities who have done threat modeling for other implications in traditional software, in cybersecurity, for example, and apply those learnings to their process. And that should guide their decision to release or not release and limit and throttle access or not. I think that's one advice that I would give. And I think this is also a space where standards are important, and this is a role here for community outside of the research community, if it can't figure it out themselves, for example, to potentially apply interventions to see where's the right line for this research to, again, to provide this amazing technology and use it for good, and yet limit its malicious implications.
So a quick heads up to all the viewers. We're about 3 minutes before the hour. There are a lot of great questions. I plan to keep going. So if you want to stick around, feel free. Related to Katja's point about importing techniques from cybersecurity, there's a big topic of discussion in cybersecurity about international norms, and a question about like, how do we deter? There seems to be an analogous question in disinformation with GPT-3 type systems. How do we deter? What sort of international norms should we be pushing? Micah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the asker of this one phrased this as a proliferation system, a proliferation problem. And I agree that that's the type of the problem we're in. I think that there's maybe some international norms could be structured around this. But really, I wanted to take this question as a chance to put the problem in perspective a bit. Because framing it as a proliferation problem sort of heightens a comparison between these as weapons and nuclear warheads. And we've been very doom and gloom, I think, throughout this session. But fortunately, disinformation is not as much of an immediate threat as a nuclear warhead tends to be. So I do think it's worth, we've spent a lot of time talking about how could you use GPT-3 to write disinformation. But that's actually sort of a comparatively easy question compared to the question, does any of this matter? We've found that there is huge disagreements in the psychological literature about the extent to which being exposed to disinformation actually sways people's actions. It's certainly, it's probably very significant. It's probably very significant at intensifying people's already existing beliefs if they exist in information systems where they're exposed to disinformation that is not regularly corrected. However, it is worth noting, I mean, to take a bit of a long-term perspective, that democracy has tended to be quite messy when it comes to news and the spread of information. If anything, the past 50 years might be sort of anomalous in terms of the relative centralization of a few major media publications. This has unraveled quite a bit in the internet age, but for most of the history of the US Republic, there's always been very partisan ecosystems where disinformation has oftentimes had an easy time of spreading. So although right now we are in a fairly unstable proliferation setup with large language models, I do think it's worth taking some time to remember that disinformation is a problem to be managed, but in many ways it's sort of endemic to democracies. And although we're talking a lot about technical or regulatory interventions, there's really ultimately in a democratic society, people need to have a certain willingness to be critical of the news they receive. And I'm sure that answer is not very satisfying to a lot of people. But ultimately, you can't solve this problem without focusing on the populace as a whole to some extent.
I'll just add a few words to this one. I think it's also important that there are other platform mitigations that are possible as well. In fact, platforms are already starting to experiment with throttling the amount of information that is coming at them, introducing intervention, introducing noise a little bit to cause users to pause, to think, and frankly or pause before resharing. And that has tended to sort of provide at least a moment for them to think through whether this is a piece of information they want to participate in spreading. However, if the volume of disinformation increases substantially, as these kinds of tools promise to do, and if we aren't able to throttle them through other means, like taking down coordinated activity and methods of delivery, then it will be challenging for humans to be able to sort through that amount of noise. I think we really need to double down on trying to increase resilience, trying to sort of introduce education about why some of these systems are exploiting our emotions and our biases. And ultimately, it's the humans that are the end target of disinformation. We can't mitigate our way out of this through just technology and just law. We have to also focus on the human at the end of the message. So lots of debate about digital literacy and how to best reach people there. I think that debate will continue as we try to adjust to sort of the volume of information and disinformation as a human race.
Thank you, Katya and Micah, for putting things into perspective there. Question for Drew. So a lot of the discussion has focused on content, creation of content by GPT-3. But if you took someone's online virtual persona to train a system like GPT-3, could it project a believable future and past and essentially build up a fake person?
Interesting. I feel like the question asker to this is either trying to make a company or a Black Mirror episode. But yeah, we looked into that a little bit too. And the answer is mostly yes, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. What we tried to do was have a headline written by various, headline filled out, like an article written by various different news sources. And like the New York Times or the Global Times or the Epoch Times. And GPT-3 was able to do that to an extent, but the amount that we were able to fit into that input space limited to some degree how much it knew about that source, or how much it was able to continue on in that style. And so it was somewhat effective, but what we did, instead we took GPT-2, which is publicly available, and then we retrained it just a little bit, fine-tuned it. And so we didn't need this massive data set that was originally needed to train it. We just needed a much smaller data set and like half an hour of training time. And all of a sudden GPT-2 was now a New York Times writer or a Global Times writer. And so if you were to take your virtual persona, you couldn't fit all of that in the input space of GPT-3. But if OpenAI were to allow you to fine tune GPT-3, which I believe it doesn't currently, but in the future, that will be an option, if not from OpenAI, then from somebody else. Then you could tweak that model so that it's not GPT-3 anymore. It's GPT-3 specialized for this virtual persona, and then it'll be pretty effective, I suspect.
And so a lot of the disinformation campaigns today on Twitter are using these fake accounts to post content. A question here from Tina Alandau asks, some methodologies for detection are not uniquely based in the syntax or the aspects of the content, but are actually about the networks of people who are communicating together to actually coordinate around a common theme. Does this imply that those methods would be more effective? And can we rely on those going forward to detect disinformation campaigns?
I can take this one. I think GPT-3 and language models outside of GPT-3 that are more publicly available, provide an opportunity to not repeat talking points, not repeat words, and not repeat lines. And this is exactly, so the kind of methodology that tries to identify commonality in the text itself and find coordination based on copy pasta messages, that's going to get more difficult. So I think we're going to have to rely on other means. And this was our point in the paper as well. We're going to have to rely on finding other ways of coordination, the infrastructure itself to be able to thwart and take down these campaigns. So yeah, I think that particular methodology of sort of spammy accounts saying the same thing is going to get appended by language models.
And is there anything that AI companies or social media companies can do to help with the detection by perhaps injecting metadata or making it easier? So I'm coming from this from the perspective of working at OpenAI and also trying to think about what technology developers can do to set us up for effective mitigations in the future. So I'm curious if anyone has any ideas there.
Well, so I'll speak just a little bit. Katya and Drew might have other ideas as well. But most of this research has sort of treated GPT-3 as given. But I do think you can raise very interesting questions about, could you alter the training process in some way? So for instance, I spoke earlier about not being optimistic about detection, especially for short strings of text. And I think that's a hard problem to overcome. But plausibly, you might want to train a language model so that it speaks like a human, but maybe has a certain preference for certain synonyms instead of other ones, or you could perturb the training process in some way so that over sufficiently long outputs, some of these more detectable signs do creep in. All of this would be very probabilistic. It could not function as a sort of very clear signal, or at least we would need a lot of AI researchers to tackle this problem and figure out how accurate you could get that sort of, let's call it probabilistic watermarking. But there are, I think, some questions, those sorts of approaches that AI developers might consider taking. Lots of open research problems to be addressed in terms of, well, how can you train a model not just to be as realistic as possible, but to be both realistic and under some conditions detectable? That's just a big open research space. I'll finish by saying, though, that I think these are really fascinating questions for AI developers to take on, but ultimately it would be, again, very hard to enforce this across the board over all people who might build these large language models, because by the very nature of it, the detection system we're talking about is probabilistic, which is quite hard to regulate or to ensure compliance with.
Right, I'll take a slightly different direction, and I'm not advocating, I'm just talking about possibilities here. Is that you might choose to have know your customer types of relationships, where if somebody's using your service, you know who they are with an actual identity, or you might keep tabs on if you're not doing it as a customer, if you're running a GitHub page or something like that, you might keep tabs on who's downloaded your models, where they were. That's obviously fallible. They could like get their sources from somewhere else, or they could take it and move it into some other place and copy it. There's all sorts of ways around that, but as a first level, you might know those things. If you wanted to get even more invasive and extreme, which again, I'm not advocating, you could potentially tag these models to call out, to say, hey, beacon out, I'm here, I'm being used this many times in this way. Those are kind of extremes that I don't advocate, but things that might be possible.
I'll just quickly chime in that we may have to bring the bright minds of AI research together and figure out if there's a standard that can be developed for that specifically identifies artificial text or synthetic text as a methodology, so that it can be detected on the wire, or explore how some of the ideas about provenance that are being explored, for example, for other synthetic media, how they can apply to synthetic text. So the idea there is that there is a declaratory statement that is included with the metadata of who is developing or using the model. And the assumption, of course, is that if there is no declaratory statement, then the assumption is that the data, the piece of digital content is suspect. The bottom line is that somehow the platforms that essentially provide the conduit for this digital data to reach humans have to have a way of knowing what this is, even to be able to flag AI content that some of them ban on their platforms. And right now there isn't such a way. This, of course, does not remove the possibility of fake news media sites being used as potential spreaders, like the recent peace data and other campaigns by the Russian actors, for example. But at least if it exists on the internet, it needs some kind of way to identify it, and we need to figure out a way of whether we need a protocol standard, for example, to do that. These are just sort of rough ideas that I think engineers and AI researchers have to come together to think through what's possible.
Thank you. I think that's a great call to action. I think a lot of voices have great things to add to this conversation. I think that's a great place to end, and I'll hand it over to Lynn.
Thanks very much. And on behalf of CSET, I'd like to thank not only Girish Sastry, our moderator, but also our colleagues here, Drew Lone, Katja Sidova, and Micah Musser. Thanks too to everyone who attended and for your many interesting questions. We wish we could have gotten to them all. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and our research updates. Our next webinar takes place on October 12th, when our guest speaker will be the Chief Scientist for NATO, Dr. Brian Wells, who will discuss collaborative science and technology development, particularly with respect to artificial intelligence. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope that we'll see you again, if only virtually, real soon.